This is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Charles Hiroshi Garrett. Today we'll be discussing his latest book, Struggling to Define a Nation, American Music in the 20th Century. Welcome to Rip Rap, Charles.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
This is a really intriguing book and that you've got here. But before we discuss the contents, I really wanted to have you share why you embarked in this musical journey.
Sure, I can answer that. It's my first book, and it's a book that has been a long time in the making, and it actually goes all the way back to the first music professor I had, someone named Mark Tucker, who was a pianist and music historian, and somebody who graduated from the University of Michigan, actually, and taught where I was studying as an undergraduate at Columbia University. Walked into his classroom and he was talking about Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, and Charlie Parker on the first day of class. And I thought, wow, jazz history course, this is great. And that actually planted the seed for some of the aspects of the book, that first class. And you know, over my time as an undergraduate student, as a graduate student, and as a professor here at the University of Michigan, I've looked into some of the different aspects of the book and developed them, and you know, finally they came together about a year or two ago when I handed in the manuscript to the press.
It always fascinates me that books have communities, and
Mm-hmm.
you have a number of people, like you said, Mark Tucker,
Mm-hmm.
but there are other people that you were working with that had significant contributions to your work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as an academic, I guess I'm sort of trained or used to trying to situate what I do in comparison to what other folks have written about before. More specifically, in the case of this book, I'm really dependent on people who've studied music and the intersection of music and politics in particular. Some of those include a professor named Timothy Taylor, another one named Robert Walser, Susan McClary, some of whom were advisors for me when I was a graduate student. And there has been a general, I would say, turn, or at least an increasing interest in talking about the intersections between music and culture and politics, and it's happened for several decades at this point. But in my field of musicology, it really seems to be something that a lot more people are interested in now. So that's, I think, my development of the book is very closely related to the teachers I've had and the moment that I came into the field.
Well, it did seem to reflect this more fresh approach to the historiography of looking at music, and you talk about that in the book. Maybe you can explain that even a little more, because that's kind of a distinct pattern of your theoretical framework.
I can answer that in a few ways. One way is that I think that from an overarching standpoint in the book, I'm interested in how culture both informs music and also how cultural tensions and maybe issues that are happening at particular times seem to weave into music in ways that we might not be even that aware of the first time we encounter a performer or the first time we hear a particular piece. So there are a few parts of the book where I'm looking pretty closely, pretty in depth at individual pieces or individual songs or recordings, and trying to figure out why would this piece make sense at this particular point in time. And in terms of kind of historiography, I try to include both a pretty close musical reading and also I'm looking out toward other scholars who have tried to make this music culture relationship, trying to figure that out. The other thing I've tried to do, at least in a few of the chapters, is I've tried to look at some of these musical pieces from a few different angles. There's one chapter that I have about, well, it's about Tin Pan Alley songs that focus on or talk about representation issues. For example, there's a song that I discuss in quite great detail called Chinatown, My Chinatown, which is basically about representing what it meant to be either Chinese or what it meant to be Chinese in America. And I was curious about not only the song, but I was curious about the sheet music that was used to market it, different recordings and different interpretations of the song, and different treatments of the song from the time it was created as a Broadway or on a Broadway stage up to the present. So there are some cases where I would say my historiographical angle is eclectic. Let's say there are some things that I do where I'll use a few different kinds of ways to look at one particular thing.
Well, you really dig down into it, which I found fascinating because it's easy to kind of bounce along the surface and make all these superficial comparisons, but you're really digging down, trying to find out how did that emerge and how did that, and the key thing you keep pointing out is power and the relations of power. I mean, you have this intersection happening, and both the people who are composing the music, not both, but the people composing the music, the people marketing the music, and the people appreciating the music, all have their reasons why they think that's an interesting thing to have.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in figuring out how music, even music that we might think is, I don't know, relatively apolitical, or music that doesn't seem to have a political edge to it. I'm curious to see how power informs how the music is actually constructed, what it sounds like, what the lyrics are, how audiences listen to that music. Probably the best single chapter in the book that talks about different kinds of power relations is the last chapter, which is about early Tin Pan Alley sheet music that dealt with the subject of Hawaii and the comparisons between what people were doing on the Hawaiian Islands, producing music there and producing sheet music there, versus how Tin Pan Alley and the publishing industry in New York and some of the major cities around the country, how they were seeing what Hawaii was. And so I think that's probably the place where I deal with the question of viewing power through different lenses. I think that's probably the chapter that goes straight at that answer, or straight at that question.
Well, it's kind of interesting, the difference between what was happening in Hawaii and what was being represented in the United States. It's kind of a question in my mind about authenticity. This kind of, so maybe you can explain a little bit more specifically what happened there.
Sure. Well, the bulk of the chapter, of that particular chapter, discusses. Let me start this over.
Sure.
The bulk of the chapter on Hawaiian music discusses sheet music representations from the United States, from the continental U.S., and those are the kinds of representations that people became used to in the States, and also a lot of the stereotypes about Hawaii were propagated by these particular songs. Now, I was curious about that whole period in U.S. music history. There was maybe 10 or 15 years almost where those songs were incredibly popular, and then different spurts in popularity over the last century. So that was my introduction to whatever Hawaiian music meant in the United States. But what I found while I was doing the research is that by looking at composers who knew about American practices, knew about U.S. practices, and were publishing music in Hawaii, that their versions of Hawaii were different. They would talk, for example, more about new tourism or new businessmen who were coming to look around Hawaii, whereas the Tin Pan Alley songs featured more more songs about the beach, the hula girl, the ukulele, all of these tropes that come to be we come to recognize as Hawaii. So it's a subject where, and one of the reasons I kept going after it, and the reason I presented it that way, is I was curious to see how different groups of people envisioned, what Hawaiian musical life was like, and I carry it through pretty much through the 1930s, and then I have a few examples that talk about some things that are a little bit more contemporary. And now in Hawaii, there are very different kinds of concerns by the musicians there and some of the music that's produced there. Some of them are just as concerned with appealing to local audiences, or appealing to tourists, or appealing to not only American audiences but also audiences from Europe or from Japan, and so the music has changed quite a bit.
I thought it was fascinating that your approach, because it allowed for this differentiation, using multiple uses, that you had a richer yield, I guess you would say, on what was happening. And one of my favorite stories was that 2006 recording of, was it Nuestro Hymno?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe talk a little bit about that, because at first glance you talk about American music and it'll be whatever particular music you listen to.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start sifting through the landscape of all the different kinds, then you run into this kind of a story.
Right. Well, in this particular song is the way I open the book. It's a song called Nuestro Hymno, which was a recording which had very familiar music and, for some, somewhat unfamiliar lyrics. The music was the music for the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem, and the lyrics were not in English but in Spanish, and they were also lyrics that had modifications, so they weren't a direct translation. This kind of thing has been done by other artists and hasn't always raised the same kind of controversy, but when this particular song was released, there was quite a lot of controversy, and it was primarily because it was released, well, because it made modifications and because it came in the midst of immigration debates in Congress, and people, both proponents for immigration reform and those who didn't want to make any major changes, they kind of latched onto it like a lightning rod, and acted as if the song, well, for some saw it as kind of a moment of solidarity, or a way to create solidarity. We can all support the United States. We can sing the Star-Spangled Banner in different languages. Others saw it as blasphemous because it not only changed the English lyrics but also made modifications to the lyrics and made it seem like it could be a song that was not necessarily about the U.S. anymore, but let's say a freedom struggle. So I thought that particular moment was useful to point out the intersections between music and politics, and also useful in terms of what I talk about at the very end of the book, which is a different song that takes the Star-Spangled Banner and kind of performs it with a different twist, or performs different lyrics in a different way, and it's a song called Our America. And I was reminded about it a week or two ago when they had the Republican National Convention, because during that convention, Our America was performed on stage. And Our America was seen by many to be, much more respectful in terms of its, let's say, patriotism, even though there were some elements of it that were kind of all mixed up and used different sayings and different quotations from famous American documents, the Declaration of Independence and that sort of thing. So these are, I think that my book in general is probably more about how politics and culture shape the music that we hear. Even if we don't realize it at first, I think that that's mainly what my book is about. Nuestro Himno and Our America I use those two as examples to both show how that can happen to, well, that happens to, these recordings or performances that continue to be common, and also that in these particular cases they have much more of an obvious political bent, or they have an obvious maybe political destination. Those two songs are much more obviously political, I would say, than a lot of the music in the book. But one of my big points is that I'm interested to see how politics and power, cultural change influences music, even if we don't always recognize it.
Well, we should point out that Nuestro Himno did have some political repercussions with Congress, and there was this reaction. You sing the national anthem, it better be in English.
It certainly did. It had repercussions of perhaps a sort that the people who made it didn't imagine would happen, right? The people who created the song were more about immigration reform, solidarity, in the face of that. And then Congress, both houses turned around and said, basically, you can't, it's not allowed, or it's not, it's not allowed to produce recordings and give performances of the Star Spangled Banner or the Pledge of Allegiance in other languages. They have to be straight on.
Which is pretty.
Yeah.
Pretty, yeah. I happen to remember Jose Feliciano's version, which caused a huge uproar and had an impact on him professionally. And then Jimi Hendrix had his version, which is still played faithfully by many, many people.
Yep.
And it is fascinating how, depending on who it is that's performing things, can add more political. I think it is an interesting point to take a look at.
I think that the way that the national anthem in particular is performed, because of those performances in the late 60s and a few more in the early 70s, that the way that it's performed has, even though those performances were sometimes seen as being kind of incendiary, that subsequent performances of the national anthem, including many that have a high degree of individuality or new kinds of melodic choices, they're sort of expected almost in certain situations now. So
after Jose Feliciano did that extraordinary performance, there were a whole lot of people singing it at the Detroit Tigers baseball games and other places. They were using much. They didn't take it quite as extreme, but much of that same thing.
Yeah. There's a professor in the department at the University of Michigan named Mark Clegg who's actually writing about that very thing, about the treatment of the national anthem and different kinds of renditions of the national anthem. And one of the chapters that he has going includes pretty full treatment of the Jimi Hendrix version. So maybe that's a trailer for books to come.
Yeah. One of the other things by using this method you use, is people like Louis Armstrong, one of the great, without question. But there was a part of the political scene, when you talk about the Great Migration, that's really helpful to understand that he was a part of that. Maybe you can explain.
Sure. Yeah, I think for Armstrong, I think he was both a participant in the Great Migration. He was a recording artist who, in some of his music, drew on experiences of the Great Migration within his music, and because of some of his recordings, he helped to propel other people to think about migrating. So he's a pretty pivotal figure in that, and also I don't think we could understand Armstrong in the 1920s and some points later in his career without thinking about his experiences of migration. There's a song that I talk about in the book called Gully Low Blues, which is an Armstrong tune that if we had heard it produced by someone else in a different situation, we might say that's a typical blues song, and what it describes is a relationship where the man is trying to get things together so the woman, basically so he won't be in the doghouse anymore. And that's one way that we can think of that song. I don't think that's incorrect, and I think that people who've heard the song probably have responded in that way in many cases. But if we look at his experience, and we look at his experience as a migrant, and the fact that he, in Chicago, was married to another migrant who, Lil Hardin Armstrong, who was a member of his band and with whom he collaborated on many, many tunes, and who plays piano on this recording. If we think of it in the sense of the migration, it's a kind of song that reveals, one, kind of a personal connection, as if there was a little friction between, or potential friction between Armstrong and Lil Hardin. Two, that it revealed, because of some of the lyrics, it reveals a class distinction between somebody who seems like they're new to the city, Armstrong, and somebody who has been there a little longer, maybe a little bit more classy, elegant, Lil Hardin Armstrong. And we get the sense that the tension between class and gender, and the fact that he's new in town, we get the sense that that is informing the whole construction of the song. So yeah, I think that the Great Migration has been used by a number of scholars actually to describe the whole journey of the blues, just generally. I don't think it has been used quite as often to talk about some early jazz pioneers like Armstrong. And in that chapter, I wanted to suggest that, well, one, in order to understand some of our most beloved figures, that we could do so productively by placing them in their historical moment. And then secondly, possibly the experience of migration could be transferred to either a few other musicians or to a few other types of music, a few other places, as a way to try to understand the origin of some of these songs in a better way.
Well, one question I had is, you talk about how this came out of, you started with the roots in terms of jazz,
Mm-hmm.
And then it seemed to spread out from
Mm-hmm.
there.
I think I have sometimes described the book as being about national identity, but when I say that, I don't necessarily mean one national identity or a shared national identity. And one major impetus for the book was to think about how to create a book that would describe different aspects of American music and suggest that those different aspects didn't necessarily add up to one single thing, but instead to use, and that was very strategic in terms of the musical choices I made in the book. There's a chapter on a classical music composer, Charles Ives. There's 2 chapters on jazz, 2 chapters on Tin Pan Alley and different kinds of popular music. So it was a choice in terms of the book to span outwards and suggest that I'm not making any claims that are limited to one kind of music. I think that my interest in doing that, in starting from jazz and then moving outward, I think that also comes from well, it comes from my education in terms of being interested in and being pushed to look in different areas. And it comes from my interests as a listener, my interests growing up. I listened to all different kinds of things and not feeling like they were all the same or that they all pointed in the same direction.
Or that you had to package it all up.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you know, I looked at jazz, but you looked at heavy metal. I mean, you know, that's quite a range.
Yeah.
And more. I mean, but I think that that's by not having a singletary approach that allowed you to look at the diversity.
Yeah.
I guess it's a terrible word sometimes, but for the more possibilities.
I can't say whether, I'll have to think about this, but I can't say whether whether my method led to this large umbrella or whether because I was interested in looking at these different things, it kind of led to a method that you know, I'm interested in certain main questions, but the way that I actually get to the depths of those questions maybe comes from different places.
I like the fact that you said that you remain convinced that without keeping the relations of power firmly in mind, no history of American music and no history of music can be complete. Because one of the things this book does, in a rather substantial way, is, and you talk about that, is to move the historiography of music along this path of taking a deeper, broader look at things.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that my contention that, you know, if you want to deal with the history of music, you have to deal with issues of power. I wouldn't say that is something I invented by no means. There have been many different scholars who've argued for that sort of thing in some different fields of music, and I think it's becoming more it's becoming maybe more accepted now than it has been before, or at least I hope so. I think that where my book is different from a lot of other studies is that I am trying to ask these particular questions as they apply to American music and really look at different facets of American music with that lens. And then in that final statement, I believe that totally. I mean, I believe that you can't possibly understand what's going on in American music if you are thinking just about the development of musical style, for example. That you have to be able to understand what's really going on, or maybe to understand in greater detail what's going on, that you have to look at power, that you have to be interested in how issues of politics and culture come in. So.
Well, I thought it was quite a fascinating study, really, and I thought it did offer some significant revisionings of, you know, who Louis Armstrong was, and General Morton, and Charles Ives, even the venerable Charles Ives. So, thank you for being a Rip Rap.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much for having me.
You're welcome.